Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today we are going to talk about Marxism after Marx Part 2. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. He has 25 years of teaching experience and his area of expertise lies in Indian political thought and political theory. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you, Amrit. In fact, today's lecture we are going to devote to this question of Marxism after Marx. And while discussing this issue, we will be focusing on certain developments which have taken place within the broad ideological discourse which is known as Marxism, and how they have tried to enrich Marxism by basically building on some of the preliminary arguments, or one can say that some of the clues which they have drawn from the Marx's own writings, and thereby they have tried to develop it in different directions, where they feel that in 20th century, particularly the context in which this entire the development within Marxism took place was important, because Marx was basically responding to the changes in society, economy and polity in 19th century Europe, but things moved much ahead of that, and therefore Marxism as a creative and critical enterprise required some important modifications, particularly keeping in the true spirit of Marxism, because Marxism is normally interpreted by a very in a very open ended discourse that it is not a finished project. Rather, Marx had a different method to approach society and the number of issues related to society and economy, and therefore Marx never considered his own project to be final and basically the closed project. Rather, it was in process of evolution, and therefore there was ample scope for the subsequent generations to make modifications and changes. So therefore, that is one important aspect of this entire development which has taken place subsequently within Marxism, because Marx himself had stated that his method which should be adopted to understand society, to understand history, to understand everything, including the ideas which Marx himself propounded, is ruthless criticism of everything that exists. And then he said ruthless in the two senses, that it shouldn't shrink from its own conclusion and it shouldn't hesitate to fight the powers that be. So therefore, that was his own statement, and therefore those who have tried to build on by taking clue from this methodological position which Marx had given, they feel that Marxism requires many important modifications on number of issues. Modification in the sense that the new developments which were taking place largely on account of the changes in the nature of capitalism, nature of technology, the nature of on account of these changes nature in society, and therefore the earlier arguments, earlier theoretical formulations were not enough to deal with this new challenges and new situation. So this is one important thing which has led to this realization and this evolution of entire discourse within Marxism. But one thing at the very outset I should also like to repeat here, in fact that Marxism has two different dimensions. One is basically a theory, another is practice, and the theory is something which basically is gets conjoined with this practice, and therefore this entire idea of praxis. And his famous statement that philosophers have only interpreted the world, thing is to change it. So therefore theory in itself is nothing, and that theory becomes a more meaningful enterprise or exercise when it is geared towards change, social change, or in the Marxian framework one can say revolution. So this entire praxis is very important. So what happened, what Marx himself did, and subsequently this tradition continued for quite some time was combining this theory and practice. That it is not that the job of a theoretician is to only formulate theories, and those theories have no direct bearing on the action of human beings or the practice of politics. Rather, theory should go hand in hand with practice. So, this tradition basically which Marx himself believed in and perhaps practiced to great extent, because he was also active participant in the working class movement of his time. Of course, none of them could result into the revolution the way it perhaps happened in Soviet Union in 1917. But nonetheless, he was an active participant in those movements. He was a close observer of those happenings, and therefore, his theory was always immersed in response to those those political events, whether they failed or they succeeded. Of course, most of the times they failed, but nonetheless, those failures inspired him to reflect more on those issues. So, this is one important dimension, and this was basically, this tradition was carried forward subsequently by Lenin, to great extent by Mao, and so Lenin, Mao carried forward that tradition when they were engaging with the revolutionary project in Soviet Union or in Russia or in China. Even in third world countries, many attempts were made in the similar fashion, and therefore, you had basically Cabral, and you had Che Guevara and many other revolutionaries coming from different parts of the world. So, this is one tradition of Marxism. But what we find that the subsequent developments within Marxism have been more on the plane of theory than on the practice of politics, and therefore, what is normally associated with the development of Western Marxism is normally understood in terms of the developments which have taken place within the broad ideological framework of Marxism, but largely on account of theory, philosophy, dialectics, and so on and so forth. Of course, even when we talk of dialectical materialism, then the two different dimensions come to our discussion. One is this dialectics, another is this materialism. Of course, when talk of materialism, it has, because Marx himself borrowed these two things from two different sources. In fact, one the German source, another the British source. But nonetheless, they became integral part of his ideas. But what we find that this dialectics and materialism, the two things, the way they are combined within this Marxian project. Subsequently, we find that much of the developments which have taken place in the Western world have been on this issue of dialectics, the theoretical formulations, and of course, dialectics not in the same way as perhaps it was being seen or being interpreted within the official communist party, that is official Marxist position coming from the Soviet Communist Party. So, therefore, much of the developments which took place in Western societies, particularly in 20s, 30s and even later, they were reaction to this Soviet communist interpretation of the dialectics or the philosophical dimensions of philosophical propositions associated with this dialectical approach to history, society, and so on and so forth. So, far materialism is concerned, there have been developments, and those developments are equally significant, particularly related to the question of the growth of capitalism. The way capitalism has moved far ahead of what it was in 19th century when Marx was writing. It has also reflected on the issue of class consciousness, that how the class consciousness in 20th century was altogether different ball game than perhaps it was earlier in earlier era and earlier decades. And therefore, how to make sense of this class question? Why in spite of such development of capitalism in Western world, why the working class is not revolting? Why this proletariat is not basically coming forward to basically break the shackles around it, particularly due to the capitalist growth? So, I mean, what happened? Because why this Marxian entire prognostication, where it has gone wrong, and therefore, a sustained analysis was carried by some social scientists, philosophers, sociologists, keeping in mind the larger contours of this Marxian theory, and therefore, they try to build on it. So, basically, the kind of work which we have seen, emerging from this concern of diminishing revolutions, diminishing role of proletariat or the working class in social change, and therefore, the kind of interest which this entire working class has developed in this entire system, which prevents it from going for revolution. So, these issues have also led to a number of theoretical churnings, and that can be broadly put within the terrain or the domain of materialism. So, both in dialectics and materialism, we find that in Western world, particularly in the academia, there has been a tremendous churning in last 100 years or so, and therefore, Marxism after Marx, it is argued at times, has flourished. It is a different matter that many critiques of these developments also argue that it is a tragedy that Marxism on the one hand has flourished, on the other hand the revolutionary project has diminished. So, there is a now a gap is basically seen in this theory and practice, that theoretically there has been a flowering of ideas much more than perhaps it was earlier. Many new dimensions have been studied, many new perspectives have emerged out of these studies, but so far as the practice is concerned, that is the entire project of changing society, entire project of bringing revolution in society, that project has not been taken forward. So, therefore, this is one criticism, that a hiatus has been created between theory and practice, and therefore, a lot of critics argue that it has deviated from the original formulation, original project of Marxism. But that issue we will take up later. But one thing we should remember, that this tradition continued with two important revolutions in spite of all their limitations. For example, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the Chinese Revolution of 1949. It is a different matter that even these revolutions took place in those societies which were not considered by Karl Marx to be the ideal site of revolutionary change, because revolution took place in Russia and revolution took place in China, which did not have the capitalist development on the same pattern which perhaps was witnessed in the Western Europe, because it was compared to the Western societies, Russia and China both could be considered underdeveloped, and therefore, the kind of role which peasants played in this revolution has also been a matter of great debate and great discussion within the subsequent Marxist discourse, because as it is well known that Marx didn't give much importance to the role of peasantry in revolution, because after all the peasants lacked consciousness. In fact, in one of the famous passages he writes that they are like potatoes, sacks of potatoes. They do not have any communication among themselves, and because of lack of communication, because of the entire rural settings, the entire agrarian settings in which they operate, that basically does not allow them to communicate with each other, and thereby prevents a kind of class consciousness, which is perhaps one of the important factors for a revolution. So, therefore, class in itself and class for itself, that they may be class in itself, but they never basically graduate to class for itself. That is the consciousness, a consciousness about their material conditions, about their objective conditions, that prevents them from playing active role in revolutionary project. But in fact, in spite of denying them the subjecthood, so far revolution is concerned, they are not agents of change. What we witnessed during Russian Revolution and subsequently in Chinese Revolution, that Lenin and Mao both considered peasants to be important part of basically this entire revolutionary project. It is different matter that we have seen that subsequently many scholars have tried to find out that what is the status of this statement, that there is no communication among them, therefore they cannot become the agent of change. And Theodor Sanin and many others who have worked on this peasantry, they have said that there is a question of late Marx, and the late Marx has started revising his position on peasantry. In fact, one of the important writing which is often cited in support of this revision within revision which Marx perhaps undertook on the question of peasantry, that is the civil revolution and counter-revolution in Germany. And in that perhaps tract Marx writes somewhere that the France has defeated Paris, and a lot of scholars interpreted that this defeat of Paris by the France, Marx is hinting at the lack of coordination and support by the peasantry led to the defeat of the working class movement. So, therefore, Marx also started realizing the importance of peasantry, particularly for social change. But so far this revolution in Soviet Union and China was concerned, basically Lenin and Mao worked with a different type of theory of revolution, which was also available within the Marxian discourse, and that is of course not the main theory but subsidiary theory, that if revolution doesn't take place in advanced capitalist society, even then in the underdeveloped societies one should wait for that capitalism to take place, rather one should go for the revolution, and this the bourgeois revolution, the job or the task of the bourgeois revolution will also be accomplished by the the proletarian revolution. So it will be two stages revolution. Initially this transitional phase, the bourgeois revolution, the task of the bourgeois revolution will be accomplished by the proletariat and the vanguard party, that is the Communist Party, and subsequently after accomplishing this bourgeois revolution it will be pushed forward, and therefore the socialist transition will take place. And taking clue from that theory, in fact this revolution was attempted in Soviet Union and China. What I am trying to say, that this question of peasants, particularly the underdeveloped societies, or question of basically making changes in those societies which are not in ideal conditions as per the Marxist formulation about or Marxist entire method of historical materialism. How to make sense of those societies, what type of theoretical formulation one can go for. These things have influenced to great extent the subsequent generation of scholars who associated themselves with this entire discourse called Marxism. And this is what we find that has led to number of new churnings. It has started with Lukács, and then we have had Gramsci, and subsequently this new school which emerged in Germany, in Frankfurt, known as Frankfurt School, and later on between the two world wars, when they had to run away from Germany and went to United States of America, and again came back to Frankfurt, and gradually became famous as critical theory, with scholars like Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and so many other great luminaries who got associated with this movement. And they tried to basically associate this entire discourse of Marxism with number of new ideas and number of new issues, including the question of culture, literature, art, aesthetics. And while doing so, they tried to bring certain new ideas which they discovered in the writings of Weber and Freud. So therefore this attempt was a novel attempt on the part of these critical theorists, mostly located in Frankfurt, but later on migrated to United States of America, largely on account of the rise of fascism and Nazism. So therefore what they did, that they tried to understand and explain the rise of authoritarianism, the both types, the both sorts, this Hitler and Mussolini type as well as this Stalin type. And therefore they try to look into this question, that why this authoritarianism has surfaced, how a democracy has been a casualty of these developments, and how human freedom could be made more secure. So therefore it is this quest for human freedom, this cultural autonomy, how the knowledge can be given autonomy from social conditions. So these were the kind of questions they started raising, and those questionings in fact in course of time became quite enriching for Marxism, because it is normally understood that this base superstructure relationship, which is normally considered to be a very important dimension of entire Marxist theory, was basically mechanically interpreted and unilaterally explained, and particularly in hands of the official communist interpreters of Soviet Union, this mechanical materialism became quite dominant. So therefore this entire reaction of the subsequent generation of Marxist scholars in Western societies were largely on account of what they considered this entire positivist tinge in this official interpretation of Marxism coming from Soviet Union. And in this entire project, they believed that human freedom was relegated to the background, and after all they believed that Marx's entire project was meant for emancipation, and if emancipation as a project has to go forward, then it has to basically prioritize this entire concept of freedom. So Erich Fromm and many other scholars who can also be associated with this entire Frankfurt School or critical school could be considered part of this initiative. So So, this is one important development which happens after this Lukács and Gramsci, but it did not stop there, and normally these developments are understood as Western Marxism, and the critique of this type of development within Marxism, they argue that this was a negative trend within the Marxist discourse, because they deviated or moved away from the politics of change, particularly revolutionary project, and they basically made it a philosophical discourse. And Marxism was not simply a philosophical discourse, because Marx believed that philosophers have interpreted the world, but the thing is to change it. So, change was an important dimension of this entire discourse, but Western Marxism was not wedded to the concept of change, rather they basically relished more the philosophical discourse than the politics of change. So, this is one criticism. We will come to this issue later if the time permits. What I am basically trying to discuss here, that these 2-3 developments in quick succession, the Lukács, who was also the part of this entire communist movement, was also associated with the Soviet Communist Party. Of course, later on he broke from it. Gramsci, active participant of Italian communist movement, and was also imprisoned by the fascist regime, and the way he started looking at the functioning of modern state, that how a state functions, how the ruling class rules, how ruling class does rule simply with the help of the coercive apparatus of the state, but ruling class also rules with the help of ideas. Ruling class also rules with the help of ideology, and therefore this dimension, which was basically underdeveloped within Marxism. In fact, this entire formulation which comes from Gramsci, particularly through his theory of hegemony, has been a very important development within Marxism. That it is not only the coercive arm of the state, which of course is a very important dimension of the working of the capitalist state, which Marx himself perhaps stated in a Communist Manifesto as well as many other places, when he said that state is nothing but the managing committee of the bourgeoisie. So, therefore, this instrumentalist view is there, but then looking at the subtle operation of the state power, that how a state of course manufactures consent and not simply coerces the people to fall in line. So, this manufacturing business of the state, the ideological state apparatus is very important, and it is here the contribution of Gramsci has been seminal so far as this formulation of this entire hegemony is concerned. Now, his entire take on this question of civil society, the two societies, civil society and political society. Civil society is the society for manufacturing consent, and political society is the society for basically using the coercive instruments of the state, and they together go hand in hand by creating this hegemony. So, therefore, this counter offensive, the counter hegemony, the role of intellectuals, which was not considered very important earlier. So, these are the important issues which were basically discussed by Gramsci, particularly in his writings, like the modern Prince and the prison notebooks, particularly the prison notebooks, which were written as manuscripts in the prison when he was imprisoned by the fascist regime of Mussolini. So, therefore, Gramsci's writings have also been equally important in highlighting the working of the capitalist state and the capitalist society in 20th century, which was perhaps not captured and grasped by Marx or Lenin earlier. Of course, there are some gaps which were there within the Marxian take on capitalism was filled very successfully by Lenin when he came out with that famous tract on called Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, because Marx perhaps did not see that phase of capitalism when it became imperialistic. Of course, the monopoly capitalism was there, but the way Lenin theorized it tried to build on the rudimentary ideas which were available in Marx, and therefore basically provided a creative interpretation of Marxism, that how capitalism was becoming an imperialist in terms of its operation, and therefore the two world wars were the reflection of that working of capitalism. So, therefore, Lenin also did it by building his argument on the rudimentary ideas available in Marx. Similarly, Gramsci basically not only built on the rudimentary ideas available in Marx, particularly so far ideology is concerned, because normally it is believed that Marx talked of ideology as false consciousness. Of course, there are instances within Marx's writings when Marx also looked at ideology as a form of consciousness, that it is not always negative consciousness, but sometimes it also becomes a kind of form of consciousness, where people start believing that it is not simply idea, but it is their life. So, this material content of ideology is also equally important, and therefore, when it comes to religion, it is always argued that Marx talked of religion in a very negative way, that is the opium of the people, but it is often forgotten that Marx, before calling it opium of the people, made many more statements, saying that it is a heart of the heartless man, soul of the soulless world, and therefore, when the society gives this soulless man, then perhaps they find a respite in religion. So, therefore, how it becomes a positive, how it becomes a form of consciousness, that was also picked up by Marx. But what these scholars, these thinkers, these revolutionaries in the Western world, Italy, France, Hungary, Poland, many other countries, Central and Western Europe, they try to build on the different dimensions of ideology, different dimensions of capitalism, different dimensions of the working of the capitalist market, and therefore came out with some significant ideas to enrich this entire discourse called Marxism, so that a true human project could be realized, a more emancipated society could be created. So, this is what normally associated with the development of Western Marxism. But it did not stop with Lukács, Korsch and Gramsci. It continued further, and particularly in Germany and France, we find that many developments which took place later were equally enriching. And it is here this entire birth of this structuralist school within Marxism can also be cited, along with certain new developments which were taking place in United States of America and other parts of the world, particularly the birth of neo-Marxism, or what is normally known as world system school or the dependency school, particularly in terms of their analysis of capitalism, the working of the capital and the market, and in that light, the future of revolutionary project in the world. So, therefore, what we find that this development, which was started with Lenin, of creatively interpreting Marxism and therefore making sense of the changes which were taking place, and therefore applying the Marxist theory to those changes, that tradition continued more in the Western world than perhaps in the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union got bogged down to this entire deterministic and mechanical interpretation of Marxism, which to some extent provoked these academic discourses, provoked these revolutionary ideas in different parts of the world. They are revolting against this Soviet interpretation. So, this is what we have to see. Now, we have discussed in this part different dimensions of the Marxism after Marx, that how they were picking up different issues and how they were building on this, particularly the ideas of Lukács and Gramsci. Thank you. good afternoon. In fact, in this lecture, what we will be doing, discussing development of Marxism after Marx, and what we will be aiming at is to have understanding of the creative interpretations which scholars and revolutionary try to give of this entire Marxian project. Of course, there are disagreements among scholars. Many scholars argue that whatever developed after Marx was not in the true spirit of Marxism, because Marxism after all was a revolutionary project, because after the death of Marx, the funeral speech which Engels gave, many people cite that speech when Engels said that he was many things to many people, but above all he was a revolutionary. So, revolution was perhaps at the heart of this Marxian project, and therefore, what they allege that this entire enterprise called Western Marxism has been many things, but not a revolutionary project, because in order to enrich Marxism, in order to show their creativity, they have diluted this main spirit of Marxism, that is revolution. So, this is one allegation, but nonetheless one should understand one thing, that why this entire quest started in the name of this Western Marxism. Western Marxism is basically the adage is given largely on account of the fact that most of these philosophers, theoreticians and scholars were located in the Western universities and Western societies, and therefore they are known as Western Marxism. Of course, Marxism itself was is a product of Western conditions. So, therefore, Western Marxism does not connote much so far as geographical location is concerned. But what is equally important, that there are certain key areas in this entire project called intellectual project called Western Marxism. For example, one important dimension has been this the kind of centrality or the kind of space or the role which has been provided to human agency in this project. And it is argued that Western Marxism basically did a great job by putting human beings at the center of this discourse, which was basically relegated to the background largely on account of this mechanical interpretation of Marxism in the hands of Soviet Communist Party and Stalin and his and his followers. So, therefore, this entire project has given importance to human agency. Number two, it is also argued that culture, ideas, art, aesthetics, philosophy, all of them were put within the superstructure, and therefore, they were considered to be epiphenomenon, and therefore, secondary in importance, and therefore, they were totally neglected within this Marxian project. And this Western Marxism, as it is called by name, in fact gave importance to these ideas, and they believe that any viable social change or revolutionary project could be meaningful, or any revolutionary project could be meaningful only if the superstructural sphere of society is also accorded equal importance, if not more than equal, or if not equal then at least a substantive amount of importance. And what are those areas? They are basically culture, philosophy, ideas and number of things, and therefore, the superstructure has to be given a due importance in any revolutionary project or any critical study of society. Similarly, they also basically started looking at the changes which were taking place in society, particularly in particularly period of advanced capitalism, particularly the way capitalism was developing rapidly and was much ahead of what it was in 19th century. So, this advanced industrial phase of this capitalism, particularly in the post-industrial situation of Europe, particularly the role of technology, the way technology was acquiring importance in the life of the people, and therefore, how people were becoming subservient to technology. So, earlier focus on the forces of production within the Marxist theory, particularly the way the Soviet Communist party and the Soviet establishment interpreted Marxism. They believed that undue importance to forces of production, because technology of course is part of the forces of production. Of course, there is also debate there, because many people believe that technology comprises of two, or techne and logy, and techne is part of basically the forces, but logy goes to superstructure, because that becomes epistemology, theory of knowledge. But nonetheless, technology at times is equated with the forces, and therefore here in fact the role of Cohen is very important, the kind of importance he has given to relations of production in the mode of production, and particularly the equation between forces and relations, in his particularly Marxist theory of history and defense, that famous book. But nonetheless, this entire question of technology basically disturbed them and troubled them, and therefore they came forward with a very interesting formulation on this issue, and particularly this entire Frankfurt school, the critical school, critical theory, has contributed substantially on this issue, particularly the Marcuse's famous work, One-Dimensional Man, that how human being has been turned into a kind of instrument. The human reason has become instrumental, and therefore human personality has been made one-dimensional, and therefore the kind of freedom which human beings should enjoy, the kind of all-rounded development which human beings are supposed to attain in society, in fact that has been completely disturbed, largely on account of this growing role of technology. So technology is another important dimension which has disturbed them, and therefore they have given a full importance to this question of technology, along with the human agency and along with many other issues. Along with technology, the issue which also disturbed them was the question of alienation, and it is here that in fact the contribution of Lukács becomes important for Western Marxism. Of course, as all of us know, that Marx's that famous book, Economic and Philosophic Manuscript, published in written in 1844, was discovered much later. But before the discovery of Economic and Philosophic Manuscript in 20th century, Lukács had already started arguing along that line in History and Class Consciousness, that famous book, where he took on this official interpretation of the Soviet Communist Party, where he tried to basically question and challenge this mechanical materialism or kind of positivism which was being posited by this official the communist interpretation of Marxism. And therefore Lukács' contribution is very important, and therefore what we find that in Marx's Economic and Philosophic Manuscript, the way Marx talks of fourfold alienation of man in capitalist society: alienation from nature, alienation from his own product, alienation from his fellow beings, and alienation finally from his own self. This fourfold alienation is basically equated with a kind of situation where human beings, in spite of having a specific human species character, which Marx says that is pre-conscious activity, the Promethean conception of man which he had, the famous fictitious, the famous Prometheus, the Greek mythology, who is believed to have brought fire from the god. So therefore, this Promethean conception of man, though Marx has in Economic and Philosophic Manuscript and at different places, in fact was not prominent in this entire discourse till Lukács perhaps basically prioritized and brought it at the center of this entire discourse, particularly the role of human beings, particularly the the dialectics between objective and the subjective factors, how in class consciousness it is not only the objective conditions but also the subjective dimensions are equally important. So Lukács' contribution therefore is quite significant, and this went on to a situation where you find that this Frankfurt school, the critical theory, particularly problematizes in much more effective manner in 20th century, particularly the role of technology, the role of human agency, the question of freedom, and so on and so. Erich Fromm and many others, particularly Marcuse, and has been continuing, particularly subsequent, in recent years, Habermas, who is also associated with the critical theory, particularly the kind of work which he produced on public sphere, on communication and different dimensions which were perhaps missing within the classical Marxist formulation. In fact, so critical theory, one can say, has done a commendable job so far as filling those missing links particularly or tying the missing links within Marxism so far as social change and creating a more human society is concerned. But this entire project of enriching Marxism, as I was mentioning, that started with Lenin as a revolutionary project. He basically contributed significantly in terms of enriching revolutionary ideas so far as the role of party is concerned, the interpretation or analyzing capitalism, particularly in advanced stage through his theory of imperialism is concerned, and on many other issues. Similarly, the role of peasants in revolution, bringing revolution in not a capitalist society, but if the situation so requires, even in a less developed society, less capitalist in a society which has not witnessed capitalist development. So, all these contributions were there, but in terms of this theoretical developments, Lukács and Gramsci have been contributions of these people have been very significant. Particularly, the Lukács, of course, as I mentioned, that picked up the thread from a number of traditions which were also influencer for Marx, for example Hegel, but built on it and thereby tried to keep the true spirit of Marxism. Similarly, Gramsci, the Italian communist leader, he started interpreting capitalism, the working of capitalist state and the functioning of the capitalist society, and particularly on the question of ideology, ideas, role of intellectuals and so on and so forth. Particularly his theory of hegemony, particularly how hegemony is something through which the ruling class rules, which is a combination of both coercion and consent, and the concept of passive revolution, that how through passive revolution the capital works in society, how basically it subdues all resistance and all voices. So, therefore, Gramsci made number of important contributions within Marxism, particularly in light of the changes which were taking place in the Western world. It is interesting that he was subjected to fascist torture, but nonetheless that didn't digress him from his entire project, because he believed that ruling class doesn't rule simply through coercion, but it also rules through consent. So, this was the beauty of his understanding and his creativity, that even the torture, the coercion of the state didn't force him to realize or say that only coercion matters. Rather, he believed that ideas and the consent equally matter. So, therefore, this ideological dimension of the working of the society, the ideological dimension of the working of the state, and particularly the role of intellectuals, the way he talked about the organic intellectual, the counter hegemony, that how the subordinate classes have to go for a counter hegemony, and how the role of intellectual becomes important, because earlier the intellectuals and their role were not considered quite significant within the Marxian project, because they are considered to be part of the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, and therefore a vacillating class. But here we find that with this new insight, the role of intellectual is understood and explained. So, therefore, we come to Gramsci. Subsequently, we find that in 60s number of new developments started taking place, and these developments were mostly in Germany, France, and United States of America, and of course, even if they originated in Europe, they migrated to USA. For example, this entire called neo-Marxism, or at times associated with the world system theory of Wallenstein, or the entire Annals school, or the kind of the Brodel Center which was established in United States of America, looking at history as a meta-narrative, the grand narrative, or large changes, not the small changes. So, this is the Brodelian, that was the Brodelian project. So, what happened that this entire neo-Marxism, normally of course sometimes scholars or interpreters club all these developments as neo-Marxism, that all developments which have taken place after Marx are neo-Marxism. But if you look at the finer distinctions, then neo-Marxists are normally referred to, neo-Marxists applies to those Marxist historians, economists, sociologists and political scientists who have been associated with this entire project called world system or dependency theory, particularly the way they try to explain the working of the global capital or the market in 20th century. And it is here the name of Wallenstein and Andre Gunder Frank become important. I will come back to them a little later. Similarly, the another development which took place was basically this structuralism within Marxism. Of course, structuralism was developing even outside Marx and outside Marxism, and here the name of Levi-Strauss becomes quite important. But Althusser, the German Marxist, his contributions are quite significant, and here we find a kind of debate also taking place between the two streams within this entire post-Marxism, one can say, that Marxism after Marx. One trying to emphasize the role of human agency, trying to emphasize the role of ideas, trying to emphasize the role of the subjective factors, whereas on the other hand we find that in a structural Marxism argument is made that it is ultimately the structural constants of the society, the structural logic of the society that has to be given due importance, and this is what perhaps Marxism is all about, and it is on this account that Marxism stands out as a different project. So therefore, here we find that two different streams coming into conflict so far as ideas are concerned. One, the scientific stream, and therefore Althusser in fact believed that in Karl Marx there was epistemological rupture with Capital, the writing of the Capital. Epistemological rupture because early Marx and the late Marx, the kind of distinction which is made. The early Marx was under tremendous influence of Hegel, and here you find this Hegelian influence led him to talk of human beings in abstract fashion, whereas and in which he talked of many things which he abandoned subsequently, and therefore Althusser argues that the Capital is the product of the mature Marx, and therefore Capital should be considered the central text around which this entire Marx project has to be understood, and therefore he believes that there was epistemological rupture in Karl Marx. Now, a lot of scholars argue that Althusser was perhaps revolting against or arguing against the Sartre type interpretation which was being made around that time, where in name of existentialism, human agency or the human identity was being problematized in such a manner that the core idea of Marxism in terms of historical materialism and dialectics, in terms of this structural logic of society, were getting diluted, and therefore he was revolting against this tendency. But nonetheless, the contribution of Althusser cannot be ignored or cannot be forgotten. For example, the way Althusser talked of over-determination, the kind of mechanical interpretation which was coming from Soviet Union and other places, that there is a mechanical relationship between base and superstructure. And Althusser, through his important writings like reading Capital and for Marx, tried to give creative interpretation of this relationship. And he said that of course there is a kind of relationship between base and superstructure which is not mechanical, but ultimately whatever results out of this interaction is over-determined result. So the concept of over-determination, and there is a equally important role to different structures and substructures in society, but nonetheless the end result will be over-determined by the logic of the structure, that is the economic base or the economic sphere. So this over-determination, the concept of over-determination, along with the role of ideological state apparatus, which he emphasized and became quite significant, because you have seen that earlier Gramsci was also doing the same thing, but Althusser took it to a new height. And this ideological state apparatus, under which you have the universities, the colleges, the schools, the churches, number of institutions of civil society, all of them are the part of a structural or ideological state apparatus. So therefore, Althusser work is equally important. But what is equally important is that Althusser influenced whole host of scholars who came after him and who tried to work on number of themes and issues related to the capitalist society, particularly the state, the capitalist state. And here the name of Pollinger has become very important. The Pollingers who also engaged with Miliband on a fierce debate on the nature of a state. And this debate is at times remembered as a debate between instrumentalist version of a state and the structuralist version of state. And because a state has been considered in the classical Marxian framework as instrument of the bourgeoisie, the ruling class. But this structural interpretation is that a state is not only the instrument of the ruling class, but at times a state also acquires autonomy from the dominant class, the ruling class, and that autonomy of course is based on the classical Marxian formulation of 18th Brumaire, when Marx argued in 18th Brumaire that there are historical occasions, situations when there is a balance of class forces in society, the state acquires autonomy vis-a-vis the different class interests, and therefore that is a contingency, that is a basically accidental or occasional autonomy. And then there are also certain moments in which the state has to, at the logic of, in order to serve the logic of the structure, has to attain autonomy, but of course it is not autonomy in the like the liberal theory, but it is a relative autonomy. It will never be autonomous from the logic of the structure, that is a capitalist structure, but nonetheless it would appear to be autonomous from the any apparent interest. So therefore it will serve the logic of the structure, but nonetheless it will not act at the behest of any class, it will only act on behalf of that class. So this is finer distinction is there, but what Polonjaz did, taking clue from this structuralism as a school of Althusser and others, and tried to build on that argument by saying that sometimes what happens that when there is a conflict among the ruling class, because ruling class is not a homogeneous whole, monolithic whole, there are number of interests, and when those interests come into conflict with each other, then a state itself becomes the arena of class struggle. So this is a very famous formulation of Polonjaz, that a state at times becomes arena of class struggle, the struggle in which the different conflicting interests of the ruling class come and collide with each other. Then what is the task for the subordinate classes? And Polonjaz advises or suggests that the task of the subordinate classes is to join this struggle and they should try to precipitate this fight, so that this conflict ultimately results into the revolutionary accomplishment of the revolutionary project. So this is what has been done on the issue of the state. Similarly, on the question of alienation, what I was talking of Lukács earlier, and subsequently you find that in 20th century many more new and refreshing ideas started emerging on the question of alienation. Bartel Ullmann and Norman Geraus and many others try to build on Marx's economic and philosophic manuscript. That is a powerful discourse, because normally it was believed that Marx had only structures in his ideas, no human beings, and after all it is a human society, and if human freedom is not given importance, then this entire emancipation will remain incomplete. So therefore Norman Geraus, Bartel Ullmann and others have tried to build on this question of alienation, taking clue from economic and philosophic manuscript. But it is not only these two scholars, but in the entire Frankfurt school, the critical school about which I was mentioning earlier, when they talked of one-dimensional man, when they talked of alienation, when they talked of technology, they basically emphasize this point, and it is here that they creatively try to harmonize the ideas of Max Weber, Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, particularly the psychoanalytical dimension, that how human beings have certain dimensions which cannot be understood simply by Marxian ideas or Weberian thought, but you have to have a kind of incorporation of Freudian notion and Freudian ideas. So therefore this entire attempt by this Frankfurt school to harmonize and combine the three great thinkers of modern times, Marx, Freud and Weber, have been very significant for explaining authoritarianism and fascism, and basically the creation of this post-industrial society where human beings have been turned into a kind of one-dimensional man, where only the possessiveness, where the region has been turned into instrumental region, not the substantive region, where exploitation of the nature has been at its pinnacle, so much so that Adorno, this negative dialectics is also equally important here when you talk of these issues of human liberation and human emancipation. So this was another issue we find that coming within the Marxism in 20th century, particularly the question of alienation anomy, and so on and so forth. And here not only Marx, but ideas coming from different traditions have been brought together in order to make this project more creative and more emancipatory. Now, later on we find, as I was mentioning, that this neo-Marxism took a different turn in terms of its explanation and analysis of capitalism, and it is here this world system theory of Wallenstein becomes important, because Wallenstein started arguing that entire world is basically the entire the capitalism has become a global. So there is one market, and all these nation states or these markets are integral part of this entire system, and he called it a world system. Of course, part of the larger Brodelian project. In fact, this was a kind of interpretation of history in terms of large term changes and the long term movements. So therefore, this world system was another important creative development known as neo-Marxism, and was trying to explain the growth and evolution of capitalism in 20th century, because capitalism's nature was changing. For as example, I mentioned that Lenin perhaps built on it and came out with that marvelous theory of imperialism. Similarly, in 20th century, in the post-Lenin period, many other Marxist scholars have tried to do the similar thing. So Wallenstein is important. Andre Gunde Frank is important, particularly through his underdevelopment theory, the dependency theory, particularly the way the American social science was pushing this entire discourse of development was interrogated by Frank and his friend, saying that development is nothing but development of underdevelopment. So this dependency theory came out of it. Now later on we find that this post-Marxism, particularly inspired by a new development in the Western social science discourse, that is postmodernism, tried to bring in new ideas, particularly related to language, particularly related to many other issues which were not earlier given due attention. And it is here that we find the contribution of the Bakhtin or Voloshinov, as he was writing in that name, has been very important, particularly dialogical imagination, the role of language in human life. So therefore, in the post-Marxian phase, we find that number of developments are taking place, making it more creative project, and the process is still going on. I will stop here. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank sir for this very enlightening lecture, and I would like to thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.